As we enter into Matthew's gospel reading, it's important to know what's come before. Otherwise, the full import kind of misses us. Right before this text, Jesus has been with his disciples and has asked them, who do they say that he is? And Peter says, well, you're the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter, and on the rock of these disciples, I will build my church. And it's a beautiful moment for Peter, and he is blessed, and the understanding of Jesus as Son of the living God is reinforced. And then Jesus begins our text today. Because Peter isn't wrong about what he said about Jesus, it's just not quite the full story. He doesn't quite see the full picture of who Jesus is. Jesus knows that and begins to fill out the picture. And the picture Jesus begins to fill out is not one necessarily suitable to Peter or probably the disciples. Peter is expecting a Messiah who will come in the kind of power of right and might and set everything as it should be. And the Messiah will do this with whatever sort of force is necessary, with whatever kind of vengeance of God is required. However, Jesus says instead, actually what's going to happen is some persecution at the hands of the chief priests and the scribes and the politics and the people. And I'm actually going to be killed, but I will be raised. And you know, most of us, if you've sat in any pew anywhere for any amount of time, you know the end of the story as well as you know the beginning. Resurrection is just part of the Christian narrative, but it's not for Peter. To be told that the rabbi he's following, who he has said is the Messiah, will be killed is absolutely anathema. This is not information Peter wants. He doesn't want to have to assimilate it into his theology of who God is or how the Messiah will come. And so he pulls Jesus aside and informs him of that fact. It's a pretty gutsy move, you gotta say. I do love Peter. It's probably just young Ann. So he pulls Jesus aside and he says, God forbid it. God forbid it. And maybe what he's saying is mostly, God forbid it that I have to understand what you're saying. God forbid it that suffering be the way. God forbid it that I have to understand my framework in a new way. And you know, we could say that Peter's guilty here and he's a one-off. But being the technocrat that I am, I can tell you that the data says we actually all only take in facts that accord with our previous worldview. We subconsciously even suppress things that don't fit what we already think about the world. So on some level, Peter just vocalizes what everyone else is doing quietly. And we're probably pretty guilty of doing this ourselves. It's not fun to have some sort of new encounter with God that makes you have to rethink what you thought you knew about God. Or have some piece of scripture or some Christian formation touch some deep place in you that says that doesn't fit with who I thought God was or what love was about. Or we encounter someone whose experience of God, because of their place in society or otherwise, forces us to kind of reckon with who we say God is. We'd much rather say, God forbid it, leave me alone. I prefer my constructed theology as it is. I prefer God in the image I have made God to what maybe God is trying to tell me about who God really is. But Peter's also very aware that following a rabbi means that you follow in their footsteps. You go the path they are carving, and you sort of follow in their lifestyle. So maybe it's just not, God forbid that this suffering happen to you, Jesus. It's also, God forbid that this suffering happen to me because I'm your disciple. Jesus says he's going to be rejected and die. Peter might hear in that, oh geez, to follow Jesus is to be rejected and it has a cross in the middle of it? Well, I really liked the parts where we healed people. And when you calmed the storm, yeah, I really enjoyed that. Feeding all those people, that's exactly what we should be doing. But suffering is not in my vocabulary. I don't want to do that. I certainly don't want to be rejected by the chief priests who are, kind of in power. So God forbid it that I should have to suffer with you. And the way of discipleship is not always the way of ease and comfort. Never is that a promise made. Health and wealth, prosperity gospels are, to my mind, inaccurate, to say a minimum. God forbid it, that the Spirit of God wants to transform me. God forbid it that I should have to re-examine my habits of mind and my worldviews. God forbid it that those should have to expand with love. God forbid it that I would have to realize my patterns of behavior have implications for other people that are maybe painful for others. To be baptized in the font or wherever is to understand that the Spirit of transformation is at work in us. And sometimes the work being done in us requires things we don't want to have to change, or we don't want to have to see the inner shadow of ourselves. And so we say, God forbid it that should happen to me. So Peter has his moment with Jesus, and then Jesus has a pretty stunning reply. It's very sharp. Get behind me, Satan. Whoa, right? There's no mitigating that. I don't think there's any possible way to soften that. But I do wonder this. So if you flip back to the beginning of Matthew, you find that Jesus, after he's baptized, goes and spends some time in the wilderness for 40 days, right? And the tempter comes along and invites Jesus to turn breads into stone, and invites Jesus to throw himself off the temple to prove who he is, and offers that if Jesus will just worship him, Jesus can have all the kingdoms of the world. And at the heart of all those temptations is really the temptation to avoid any suffering. Just turn the stones into bread so your belly will stop aching. You could eat, Jesus. Just throw yourself off the temple, because then you don't need to suffer the rejection of the chief priests or the scribes or the Pharisees, because obviously they'll know who you are when the angels catch you. Why don't you just worship me, says Satan to Jesus, because then I can just give it all to you. No need to suffer anything, argue with anybody. And Jesus says, get away from me, Satan. And it's a turning point in the gospel. Jesus goes from there, having rejected that way of power, into his ministry of love for other people. This is an equal turning point in the gospel. And something of what Peter says is temptation. It's temptation to take the easy way out. God forbid it, Lord, that you should go and suffer. But that's about what's going to happen for the rest of this gospel. And Jesus hears the temptation in it, but he doesn't tell him to get away, Satan. What he says to Peter instead is different. He says, get behind me, Satan. See, because as Jesus says, Peter's not trying to tempt Jesus. He doesn't mean to do it. But he has in mind human things, not divine things. And Jesus knows that, and if we know anything from the Garden of Gethsemane and other places, Jesus isn't masochistic. He doesn't want to have to die on a cross. He doesn't want to have to suffer. He'd like another way out. And Peter again offers it. And Jesus has to firmly say no to it, take a step back. But really, take a step back, Peter, get behind me. Isn't that the appropriate place for a disciple in the first instance? there's a sense that that Peter wants to be the Messiah himself. Tell God what to do. Take the lead. And Jesus just says, strikingly, get behind. Aren't you following? Why are you trying to lead? Because the truth is, Peter's just forgot the fundamental orientation. The discipleship is following. And that seems to be true. In a culture highly obsessed with leadership and leadership training and all of the rest, following isn't something we talk a whole lot about. In fact, we kind of belittle it. Oh, my kid's a follower. Oh, they're just following rules. But we sit here today of people who are called to be followers of Jesus. And every time we stand in front of Jesus and say, God forbid it, I really want you to change my heart on my timeline. I really would prefer that I not have to carry any sort of burden in this journey or change anything. I'd really prefer not to have to think more deeply about my faith. Maybe Jesus just politely says, aren't you a disciple? Why are you trying to be the Messiah? Why don't you just follow and trust that the God of all creation is leading you to a place that is good, is leading you to a place that is right? Because the thing about following Jesus isn't that Jesus is on a power trip. It's that that's where you find life. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for the sake of the gospel will find it. And it's not about the Messiah on a power trip that we follow. It's not about stay in your place. Discipleship helps us follow where Jesus is going, which is to the kingdom of light and love and life. To be a disciple is to walk the way of love. It costs something. But to walk the way of love is to discover that we are beloved children of God, who's taking us on a journey of growing more and more and more into the image of Christ, more and more in love with ourselves and with God and with our neighbors. Yes, it may mean we have to rethink our thinking or rethink our faith, but it will be on a journey that expands love. You save your life in discipleship. You find who you really, really are in God as you follow Jesus. And it opens up a lot of freedom. Like Romans says, you don't have to know more than you know. You don't have to pretend to do that. You don't have to be God. You don't have to make all the decisions. You follow where God is leading. You listen for the Spirit, and you find out what love is calling for in your life. So maybe get behind me, Satan, is a little bit harsh. But maybe would you like to be a disciple and follow where God is calling is an incredible life-giving invitation. Jesus Christ calls all of us to follow. May we get behind Jesus, the one who loves us, the one who created us, the one who takes us on the journey of a lifetime. And may in following, we find our true life, find our joy, our salvation, and grow ever more in love, loving ourselves and loving God and loving one another as we walk in the kingdom of light.